Welcome back to CBH Talks. Today we're exploring a question that every family enterprise eventually faces. How do you preserve what made you successful while adapting to a world that no longer looks like the one that created your success? Now, in today's interview, we're going to be looking at the story of a family that spent more than a century navigating the challenges of business, politics, society, and economic change on Prince Edward Island. Our guest today is historian Ed MacDonald, whose article follows three generations of the MacDonald family of Panmure Island from 1805 to 1919. Through their story, we'll gain a remarkable view into the world of merchants, shipping, landholding, resource industries, political influence, and family enterprise in Atlantic Canada. Now, the article asks a question that is still very relevant today. How do businesses adapt when the world around them keeps changing? Now, by tracing one family's successes, setbacks, and reinventions across more than a century, Professor MacDonald offers us a rich portrait of entrepreneurship, resilience, and the forces that shape economic life. Ed, welcome to CBH Talks.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be
My
here.
pleasure. Great. Now, one thing that I really enjoyed about your article is that although it is centered on a single family, it ends up telling a much larger story about business, adaptation, and economic change in PEI over more than a century. So, to start us off, who were the MacDonalds of Panmure Island? I'm wondering if they were maybe distant or even close ancestors, and what it was that drew you to their story.
Good question. And actually, MacDonald is the commonest name in the province of Prince Edward Island. In this instance, I am a relative, although a distant one. And what drew me to their story was my encounter with Andrew Macdonald, one of the characters, in my youth, because he signed the mortgage, or I should say lease, or the deed on my family home when I was a little kid growing up in Newport, which is about 3 miles as the crow flies from where this guy lived. And then I found out he was a father of Confederation, and his signature is on a document that's a part of our own family history. So ultimately, I actually was a roommate with some of his relatives, and so my interest was stirred because here was a figure from the doorstep of my life who had a national kind of a profile. And the more I dug into it, the more I found out that the family had a fascinating sort of a backstory. And years and years ago, I was going to do a PhD on Andrew Macdonald. And my advisor said, there's not enough information, and biography is out. No one's doing that now. There's not enough information. It's not really worth your while. Well, there's more information than we thought that's come to light. And the story is such a fascinating one and such a revealing one that I wanted to do something with it. And this is what eventually emerged.
So at what point did you realize that it was more than just, simply a family history?
I think two things happened. One, there was a new sort of collection of things, of materials that came from the family. So a descendant of that family gave to the public archives on PEI about a decade ago a trove of material that added a great deal to what we knew. And when I started to look at that and saw the details of the family business, the problems with their land holding, it occurred to me that here was a family that, as you had been saying, a little bit earlier, had to adapt over the course of a century as their environment changed, the political environment, but also the physical environment and the economic environment. And then I said, this is a mirror into a world, and a mirror, or I guess a lesson in how to adapt. And I've been in the last 20 years or so involved in also environmental history. And it seemed to me that there was a business history that was a part of the change in the environment. So it was a blend of the two, and I was attracted to that as well.
Yeah, that environmentalism piece is something I'll touch on in a little bit. I agree with you. I think it's really sort of central and important to the story. Um, what was it that made Andrew A successful when he was compared to the other merchant families that were operating on PEI at the time? Or were there any other merchant families on PEI at the time?
No, absolutely. There were people involved, particularly in trade and commerce. But commerce was mixed up with transportation as well. Small market on the edge of a big world, a long way, or so I should say that we were, as you know, I should say, as a producer, we were small. The markets were across, an ocean away or along a coastline away. Andrew MacDonald had the benefit of family. He went into a business set up by his father for him with his brothers. There was a shrewdness and an integrity, but he was also part of a cadre of merchants who built ships, who were involved in a kind of a mercantile trade, and took advantage of their international kinds of networks. And I think that's something we forget often when we talk about, the history on PEI. We think of it as an insular place. It's an island. It was isolated in the wintertime for over a century. And yet, if you were a merchant, you had an international network of knowledge, trade, and contacts. That's where your markets were. And so these people had a foot in two worlds. They had to know what was happening in Europe and down in the US, and they also had to know what was available locally and what was, needed. Andrew MacDonald had a skill, he and the brothers, the three A's, as I would call them, Archibald and Augustine. They had a skill and they had a prudence that was a product of their time. They also happened to come of age in a period when our economy was expanding rapidly, kind of a golden age for the island economy. At least in retrospect, it's seen as a golden age. Their father, grandfather had a different environment in which they moved. And for a while they prospered, although each had their challenges. Even Andrew A ended up, losing his business, which is a part of the story which is a bit, later on.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that really came through very strongly in your article was that success really wasn't static, right? Like the world, throughout the story, the world is really changing very rapidly, and the whole family has to adapt. And in fact, your title emphasizes the challenge of change, right? So, what
Yeah.
kinds of change were the McDonald's at large, maybe the whole family, confronting over the century that your article takes place in?
Absolutely. Well, Andrew MacDonald, the father of the clan, he's a tacksman in Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland, a smuggler, as it turns out, and a merchant. So he's a landowner, he's a merchant, he's a smuggler. He comes to a Prince Edward Island in 1805, 1806. That is essentially a wilderness. The resources are essentially untapped. Now, the forests aren't cleared, but the forest is a resource. And this is just at the time when the pine trade is starting to wax in North America, British America. And so he's able to take advantage of that. He also happens to buy an estate on PEI at a time when land was available. Large estates were available, and available here on PEI that for various different kinds of reasons weren't available elsewhere in the eastern half of the continent. So he's able to become a landed sort of gentry. He gets to trade on the fact that he's kind of a Catholic Highland aristocracy, and he gets to exploit a resource base that's essentially untapped. His sons, he had 12 sons, 2 of which he took into the firm with him. His sons inherited a world where the resource base was not yet exploited, but was beginning to change. Shipbuilding was becoming more and more important, both as a way to get things to market, but also as a product for export. And the ebbs and flows of those economies are international in scope, controlled by factors they don't get to control. And in the son's case, they prosper for a while. They're overtaken by changes in the economy, overtaken by the challenges of their landowning. And again, it's a tangled story about how they came to lose their estate. A censored story in the family. They told it many times and either didn't know or concealed some of the dubious aspects of how the property was acquired. But essentially, they lost their land in a lawsuit, chancery suit, as a result of that suit. And so Andrew and brothers had to essentially start from scratch. They had the family name, they had status, but they didn't have a lot of money. And so they, however, come of age, as I said, when the island economy is rapidly expanding. Each of the groups or generations takes advantage of what was available in the resource base. The island economy is a resource extraction economy. It's not industrialized. There is, in fact, no large industry. It doesn't have a mineral base to exploit. It has the forest, the sea, and the land. And that's what they exploit.
So then I guess it's an interesting question because, the family business spans 3 generations, at least in your article. And so and the fact that they had to reinvent themselves so many times throughout that because they'd lost everything, right? It kind of makes you wonder, was the family's greatest strength its business skill or was it its ability to adapt?
I think it was a resiliency, which I guess is a business skill, but more closely tied to being able to adapt. So just to cite just a couple of small examples, in the early days of their business, so 1806 until the 1820s and 30s, the settlement on PI is advancing but slowly, and people live on the coastline. They're scattered. They're a long way apart. The roads are pretty poor, especially for moving large goods. So the MacDonalds had a store, first on this small island of Panmure Island at the mouth of the bay, Cardigan Bay. And then they had another store in the same area, I guess. And in the beginning, it's easier for them to take their store to the people than for the people to come to the store. And essentially, they're traveling on the water, not by road. But as settlement spreads, they relocate to the capital in Georgetown, the capital of their county in Georgetown, which is slow to develop but begins to develop. And again, it's an entrepot. People come to Georgetown, was at the end of a peninsula at the beginning of a bay. So it's a great place as a terminus, but it means people have to come to the town of Georgetown. And eventually the MacDonald brothers find that doesn't work anymore. You can't expect people to come all the way to where you are. So you don't take a schooner out anymore and operate a mobile store, but you operate a branch of stores, a set of stores in Montague, Murray Harbor, different parts of the county, because they realize that as the settlement spreads, the road network spreads, that they have to locate where the business is going. So that's just one small example of how the landscape starts to change. They have to change with it. So there's an ability to adapt and a resiliency in the face of the crises that every business has to face over time.
Did you find, in your research, did you find moments when the family's future seemed genuinely uncertain?
Oh, absolutely. I think the great fear. So Andrew Macdonald is a man on the make, and many early immigrants. So this is Andrew Macdonald who comes over in 1806. He sends most of the family over the previous year. He's a man on the make. He has audacity. He knows how to bluff. He knows how to run pretty close to the edge of what's legal. And in that wide open kind of environment of a frontier, he prospers. However, there are lawsuits stemming from how he acquired his land. After he dies, those lawsuits come home to roost. And by that time, his sons, what they pursue is status. They want to be accepted and regarded as gentry, to be respectable. I think Andrew, the founder of the firm, was less concerned with that than he was with getting ahead. But the sons want to be regarded as gentlemen, and the lawsuit wipes out uh, the inheritor of the estate or the guardian of the estate. It essentially, wipes out his fortune. And at that point, no money, does that mean no status? Can you maintain the respect you entertain at a social level if at a financial level you're ruined? And he manages to patch together an income. He has a customs appointment. He's a collector for that area, for the customs department. He has served in the legislature. He protects some of the estate. There's a long story in the article about how he fights tooth and nail to preserve their home on Panmure Island from the auctioneer's block. And eventually the family do get it back. But I think their future is very much in doubt. For Andrew Macdonald, the eldest of the sons, Hugh is their father. For Andrew Macdonald, the crisis comes after 30 years or 25 years of success, when the business that he goes into with a brother-in-law goes bankrupt because the brother-in-law has mismanaged the business while his back was turned. And all of a sudden, he's ruined. His brothers and he were in one of the businesses together. They buy him out, partly to shield themselves from creditors coming after his money. Andrew Macdonald has to live the rest of his life on his reputation. Luckily, he has a good reputation, a sterling one in terms of political respect, but also the respect for him as a person. So he gets appointments, and he lives off those appointments as governor to the Senate, etc. But he doesn't die a wealthy man. He survives. The firm they found survives, and that's the thread through this, is the firm founded by the Macdonalds. It survives as well, but it also has to adapt to the end of the pine forest, to the collapse of the shipbuilding industry. Even the mackerel trade, which they were involved with in the mid-1880s in the Gulf, the mackerel trade goes down the toilet. And so Archibald John Macdonald, one of the brothers of Andrew A., he gets into lobster packing, and it saves the family business. And I think if you were to look at 1878 to 1880, I think that's a crisis point as well, where the business could have gone under.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. That was one of the themes that I really thought was an interesting thread that wove through the article. And it was sort of how, as the family accumulated wealth, their priorities really began to change. Right. And I think this is something that we often see in family businesses, is this tension between entrepreneurship and social status, right? Gentility. I wrote down that, the patriarch of the family, the original Andrew, he was this big freewheeling entrepreneurship personality. He was an adventurer. He was a pioneer. And then you fast forward a couple generations, and the words you used were taciturn and prudent. Right. So we have a very sort of different sensibility that comes out through later generations. And do you have any insights into why this so often happens in successful families and successful family businesses?
Well, I would have said it's kind of a cliche that the first individual, makes the money, and then the children and the grandchildren spend it. But often they do, even if they don't spend the family money, the fortune, they become more interested in culture, status in society. And in Andrew A's case, Andrew and Augustine and Archibald, that taciturnity and prudence, I think, is not a rejection of their grandfather. And now Andrew MacDonald, who is the eldest of those three, he's born in 1829. His grandfather dies in 1833. So he doesn't know his grandfather, but he grows up with the knowledge of how the family fortune has been affected by the grandfather's freewheeling ways. There's a lot of pride. Highlanders are stereotyped for their pride, and I think there is a lot of pride. And the prudence, the taciturnity, in one sense, it's an expression of pride. So they don't reject their grandfather. They don't talk about him being a smuggler in Scotland. But on the other hand, they're not embarrassed by him. But they also crave respect, and that respect comes through a kind of restraint and a kind of reserve, a kind of habitual reserve. Angus MacDonald, who is one of the sons, we haven't actually mentioned him. So Andrew Macdonald has 12 sons. One of them is Angus. Angus is remembered in a memoir as being a very friendly, genial, outgoing guy, but addicted to drink in his later years, and which was a factor in him going down in life and ending his life essentially in poverty. So it's not that they are unsocial, but there's a certain level of reserve that they think comes with your station in life. And one gets the sense, and they're involved in politics, and they know how to play rough and tumble in politics. They're involved in politics, I think, to protect their interests more than because it's a game. But what they crave is respect. And I'll say one more thing about that is these are Catholic Highlanders. And I think part of the inheritance of being a Catholic Highlander is that you crave respect. The penal laws, the laws in England had meant that Catholics were, until 1829 in England and the following year in PEI, you were not allowed to vote. You couldn't hold office. You couldn't be elected to office. Now, the penal laws were not enforced on Prince Edward Island, but the social weight of the penal laws, this sense that Catholics were a discriminated against group, I think weighed heavily with the Panmure Island MacDonalds. They were proud Catholics, proud to be Catholic, practice their faith. But I think there's a bit of a hangover from being a recusant group discriminated against legally, socially. And I think that also contributes to how much they value social respect on the broader level. And that maybe contributes to that kind of mindset or the characteristic, which is less, what would you say, flamboyant.
Yep. And that you also brought up another, I think, major theme in the article is the overlap between business influence and political influence, right?
Yes.
So how intertwined were business and politics on Prince Edward Island during this period?
I think personal connection in business and politics mattered as much as political affiliation. But I do think that Hugh and Angus, who are sons of Andrew, the original Andrew, it's too bad the names are all so similar. It's so confusing for people.
Hard to keep them apart.
Andrew Sr. has 12 sons, as I mentioned before. So Angus and Hugh are among the first Roman Catholics elected to office in the province once Catholics can vote. And I think they capitalize a little bit on the fact that they come from a taxman class and they think Catholics owe them some deference. But they obviously are seen as representatives of their faith. And I think they get involved in politics, and I think the family continued to get involved in politics, partly because it's expected of social leaders, people of stature and status, but I think largely because it gives them an opportunity to protect their interests. Sometimes their interests come in the way of appointments to offices that have an emolument of some kind, but I think also it's what happens at the political level affects us at the economic level. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, and we need to have a say there. I think also if you crave stature, status, and respect, the prestige is perhaps less important to them than the respect. So one of the sources that we have that I used in this article is a memoir written by Archibald J. MacDonald, when he's 76 years old. So he's looking back at his life. And he professes not to really care about politics. He never paid any attention except when the House was in session or when there was an election. But he seems rather proud to have been a member of the legislature for 36 years, an all-time record. I think Andrew MacDonald is rather proud to be a father of Confederation. He's the second last one to die, actually. So by the time that he dies, it's a big deal being a father of Confederation. And people come and they ask him, what happened? What happened in 1864 in Charlottetown when the conference met? What happened in Quebec? And it turns out he took notes at Quebec, which are a source that we use all of the time to unravel those sets of negotiations. But I think he's proud. So they may be modest in bearing, but I think there's a lot of pride in political achievement. And two of them are governors of the province. I think that's not repeated in island history. I think that they're the only instance where two brothers are appointed to be the governor, albeit 30 years apart.
That was actually going to be my next question, is how typical were the McDonalds of the island's economic elite? So you're saying, obviously this is the only instance of two brothers becoming the governors, but were the island's economic elite, were the other families involved in politics in a similar way, or are the McDonalds an exception?
No, I don't think they're an exception. I think that they are an excellent example, but not an exception. A lot of families protected their interests as merchants by getting involved in politics. You'll notice it's perhaps accidental, maybe not. Andrew marries an Anglican, so he doesn't marry within the church. And he marries an Owen, and the Owen family are leading members of the local aristocracy, if you will, on an island scale aristocracy. So a very respectable family. He would have known them. They had property in Georgetown area. His brothers marry. One marries a Murphy who moves to PI from England. The other marries actually a cousin. But Andrew marries into the Protestant elite. I think it was a love match from everything I've been able to glean. His wife was an extraordinary woman. But I also think it's no accident that opened doors for him. It also introduced him to a brother-in-law who ruined him in business. That's another problem.
You win some, you lose some.
Yeah.
Now, another thing, you touched on this briefly in the beginning. Another thing I really appreciated about the article is that it doesn't treat business as something that's happening separately from the natural world, right? Like this is very much sort of an extractive environment. So I'd like to talk about the environmental history just briefly. What role did geography play in shaping the family's opportunities?
A huge role, I think. They exploited the opportunities, the landscape, the environment made available to them. So Andrew MacDonald, I often think, do people like to come to an island? Do they feel trapped? Is it the island trope of exile? Or is it the island trope of refuge? Well, Andrew MacDonald, the senior, was born on a small island, moved to a small island off the coast of a slightly larger island. So they're used to being surrounded by water. They're used to communicating by sea. So they come to an island, they exploit the wilderness to build ships, to export wood. They operate stores, so they import goods to sell to the settlers. When the shipbuilding industry expands, they expand. When the fishery for mackerel finally starts to take off with islanders in the mid-1800s, they build schooners. They get involved in the fishery. They supply places in the Maritimes with food. They sell goods in Newfoundland where people fish, but they don't grow a lot of their own food. When the landscape changes and it's no longer profitable to export lumber, they don't. They get out of the shipbuilding industry just before it collapses on PEI. Now, every place else in the region, the industry goes down slowly. On PEI, it collapses within the space of 3 years. They get out before that happens. They get involved in lobster canning just on the crest of the great lobster canning boom. And they're involved in a significant way. At one point, he's employing 200 employees in his lobster factories. Or I should say it's Archibald MacDonald at this point. So as one opportunity presents itself, They appear to be able to identify it and exploit it. And the opportunities are the result of environmental change, because it's a resource extraction economy with a limited amount of actual resources. And they seem to be able to find a way to get into or adapt to the change quickly enough to keep their balance in an economic sense.
Yeah, and really, as we move towards later generations in the story, we start to see a very different economic world that's emerging, right, than the one that we began with at the beginning of the article. And by the early 20th century, it's almost like the world that created the family's success was beginning to disappear. So my question for you is, if Andrew MacDonald could walk through PEI in 1919, what change do you think would shock him the most?
One of the things he would have said was, they tore down my brick house that I built. The first, brick
Prove it.
house in that part of the colony. I think he would be, as many islanders were. If you look at the history of PEI in the late 1800s, there's this quiet sense of awe. We have conquered the wilderness. We have transformed wilderness, which for them has negative connotations, into a pastoral landscape by the sweat of our brow. We have created a society. And I think Andrew MacDonald would have cocked an eyebrow at how the physical world had been transformed. He might have smirked a little bit that his grandchildren were a lot more respectable and a lot more wedded to being respectable in the society of 1919 than he cared about in the society. Now, not that he didn't care to be important or respected, but as I said, he was a freewheeling, flamboyant sort of figure in a lot of ways, and a good bluffer. So I think he would have said, wow, everybody seems to be a lot less or a lot more risk averse, to put it a different way. But he also, I think, would have said, you have done well keeping your balance on the deck, the pitching sort of island economy deck. Keeping your balance for 100 years is no mean feat. I think it would have been proud and bemused and impressed.
That's pretty good. I'd like my grandpa to be those things about me.
Yeah. I'm
Right?
fascinated by Andrew MacDonald. When you read his letters, and there are a lot of letters from Andrew MacDonald, I don't know what to make of him, because he always has a plausible story to explain things that other people think are borderline criminal.
Right. He was a very interesting character as we went through. Like, there, some of the stories in the article, like, the part in the beginning where they had two different lots of land and like came up with all of these reasons why he should be the one who, shouldn't have to pay for this and should be able to maintain it. And I was impressed with some of his creative solutions to his problems that came about.
And I mean, his legal arguments may well have been true. The problem was he could not produce the evidence to convince the Chancery Court in the end that his claim for how he acquired his property and to explain some of the anomalies in the record couldn't be established to the satisfaction of the court, despite the fact that his family had the sympathy, I think, of the court. But they lost the Chancery suit.
Yeah.
They lost.
Well, and I mean, even with that happening in the first generation, we see the family really able to evolve successfully, even though they were like increasingly swimming against the current, I think, in this story, which for me raises what might be the biggest question at the heart of the article, which is how much of the MacDonald story is uniquely Prince Edward Island and how much reflects the experience of family businesses everywhere, right? Like, we see all kinds of legal problems in family businesses that people have to work through, and then, adaptations and evolutions of markets. So how much of this is uniquely PEI and how much is sort of, just a standard family business story?
Is it a paradox to say it's both
Not at
unique
all.
and representative? Because it is unique. Prince Edward Island, like all businesses, every place is unique. So a business in a place is going to be unique because it's that place where physical environment, humans, kind of intersect. But we kid ourselves on Prince Edward Island if we think that whatever happens here doesn't happen anyplace else or is entirely one of a kind, singular.
Mhm.
I think looking at the MacDonald family, if we don't look at specifics, the details, if we look at it in context, we see it is a representative story of how in Canada in general, over the course of the 1800s, family businesses faced many of the same challenges and opportunities, depending upon the state of the development of the economy and the part of the world that they lived in. So the details are unique, but I think in a broad sense, we can learn from the MacDonald family story lessons that we can apply on a larger level.
Mhm.
And it humanizes. I mean, one of the points I try to make in this article is that we look at large-scale environmental change, we look at economic change at a macro level, but when it's translated into a human story about individuals, it's a reminder to us that individual agency is a factor in history,
Yep.
and that individual acumen, weaknesses, actions do make a difference. Now, the larger wheel of history isn't pushed around by my shoulder or yours, but maybe just a little bit. A family or an individual do have a larger impact. And it's good to be reminded of that and have a kind of humanizing of our sort of analysis of the larger stories.
And that you might have just answered my final question, which is if there's one thing you hope readers take away from this article, what is it? Is it that or is it something else or is it a combination?
No, I think it is largely that. I've been obsessed in recent years with how Prince Edward Island as an economy was able to adapt. I mean, there's a storyline for the PI economy. We have our golden age in the mid-1800s, as did the Maritimes, if you look at the mythology of the whole region. And then we join Confederation, our economy falters, we hit a wall, on PEI, the population actually declines. There's a sense of stagnation, frustration. And so looking at the MacDonald story, while I began it because I was interested in the MacDonalds for the sake of the MacDonalds, it became clear to me that this is a way for us to approach how islanders did adapt um, throughout the history of PEI, and especially after 1873, when the island economy did hit a wall, whether it was because we became a province of Canada or because we'd reached the limits of a resource extraction economy. So looking at this family helps us understand what's happening on PEI, but I think I did come away with a sense that there's an applicability on a larger level that makes this more than just of, what we say, minor interest to people not from PEI or whose last name is not MacDonald.
Right.
I think there is a larger story that this opens into.
Yep. That takes us to the end of our time today. So, Ed, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights about this article with us. And reader or viewers, on behalf of the entire CBHA, I'm Tabitha Fritz, CBHA board member. This is CBH Talks, and we will see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Okay, I lost my mouse.